I get asked a lot, what is classical education? I'm in an environment where people are interested in it. And so I'm sure many of you have been asked this as well. Maybe some of you still struggle with the definition. So I'll just start with my easy go-to 2-point definition. And I'm sure many of you will want to correct it. But I have an easy 2-point definition that I use because I try to think of where the people I'm speaking with are coming from. My 2-point definition is that, first of all, classical education includes particular foundational content. It's teaching these foundational sources. That's my first point. And second, it promotes a particular disposition towards those sources, one that looks for what is good and what is true and what is beautiful. Now, of course, when we add Lutheran in there, classical Lutheran education, it's actually easier to define what's Lutheran. So I'll leave it for now at defining what is classical education. And this talk today gives me a chance to dig into that 2-point definition a bit more. I think any definition, maybe you have another one you would like to offer in the Q&A time, but I think any definition of classical Lutheran education, any definition of classical education, more broadly speaking, ought to make reference to the inclusion of specific texts, which in the modern era have been popularly known as the great books. This is the English translation of the Latin boni literae, a phrase which I will unpack here just a little clumsily as the culturally and aesthetically important writings that are not sacred scripture and yet are useful for moral and ethical instruction. So first, the first part. Great books are culturally and aesthetically important. Great books might be culturally important simply because they inevitably inform our knowledge of history. Here we have to attend to the truth of things. For example, if you want to know about the concept of democracy, you better study some Greeks. If you want, if you want to know more about the concept of democracy, read de Tocqueville. You should read Jefferson, right? You should read these foundational sources if you want to know about democracy. And another point of guidance then, not just something being culturally important, is the text is aesthetically important. It contains beauty. These are not mutually exclusive categories. Great books might be aesthetically important in that they are an excellent representation of a particular craft. This is one way that classical education still can add to its bookshelf. The Boni Literae has never been an entirely dead canon, but I think we can hear later on why we prefer the older material to the newer material. But certain works like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the poems of Emily Dickinson, right? These, at different points in history, were obscured or lost. So for a while, they did not actually play an active role in the wide cultural conversation. They might not have been culturally important in an active sense. However, they have since become active, brought into the stream of an ongoing conversation. You'll find them, if you went to Dr. Veith's talk earlier, you'll find them, in the omnibus, and they're brought in because of their aesthetic excellences. They are a product of culture. They reveal their supreme knowledge of craft, and they contribute unique elegances and ideas that cannot be found elsewhere. I guess one more side point of definition before I move forward here is modern education has generally subdivided the broad category of the great books into disciplines like history and English and philosophy. Traditionally, the great books are not so easily subdivided. I'm not saying that we should avoid those modern categories. Certainly, there are distinctions found throughout the history of classical education. And works of history and philosophy are certainly culturally important, works of literature, aesthetically important. So I'll just to be clear, when I'm talking about the great books here, I'm talking about a wide set of books that include history, philosophy, literature, things like that. So back to reiterate my first claim. Any definition of classical Lutheran education, any definition of classical education, more broadly speaking, ought to make reference to the inclusion of the great books. Implied here, we ought to be prepared to uphold the goodness of the great books. This English phrase emphasizes the one part, our English phrase, the great books, emphasizes the part that these books are culturally important, they're aesthetically important. But we often don't hear the Latin connotation, the boni literae, the goodness of these books. And I'll admit, even as I listened to Pastor Paul this morning, it's still, is a tension within me, right? There's something of an uncertainty and a hesitation when I think hard enough about classical education's valorization of certain books that are not scripture. Like Aristotle. Solomon, the wisest of all, recognized the weariness that accompanies endless writing, and he himself was seduced by the pagan high places. And I'm certainly not Solomon, but I do know the sin of literary gluttony. I confess publicly that I've sometimes worshiped on the high places. I've enjoyed pagan literature too much, probably. So I understand. I know from experience that some Lutheran educators are suspicious of classical education's privileging of certain sources for this very reason. It's not a progressive agenda for a lot of Lutheran educators. It's a concern that we are worshiping on the high places. There's this love, it seems to love cultures and works that are not sacred scripture inordinately. It can seem, at least, to want more than the one thing needful. Philip Melanchthon knew this line of argument pretty well, but he sees these dissuasions from the great books, often coming from this kind of theological argumentation. He sees the dissuasions as false temptations in themselves. In one of his early university lectures, he says, "The unceasing enemy of humankind leads our minds away from admiration and love for what is true and good by whatever kind of deceit he can. And he blinds our eyes by false appearances and obscures them to such an extent that we see and cherish anything rather than that which we should have seen and cherished most." And here he's talking about Homer. What happens when we avoid the study of great books, he says, is we end up still making other gods. Only this time, our other gods are of more workaday things. Our career, perhaps, putting food on the table, or anything else that seems useful to us. Melanchthon continues, he says, that studies and writings are neglected in our times. Each one rushes towards the mean and gainful arts. They are slaves to their detestable desires and to their stomachs. And they know no God besides these. So he goes further, and here we must listen with some recognition of the genre of polemics, right, that he's working within. He compares the kind of humility that gets rid of what is good and true and beautiful, gets rid of the great books. He sees that as a false humility. He compares it with the humility of Herod. He said, when Herod The king of the Jewish people was raised to royal honors from humble and obscure origins. He ordered all books containing genealogies to be burnt and destroyed so that the distinction between nobility and obscurity was removed. The obscurity of his own origins would be less disreputable. In just the same way, uneducated men hate literature and want it destroyed, hoping that thereby they can hide their own ignorance better. Again, part of this is rhetorical, all right? He soon asked forgiveness for the levels of his complaint and distress. So he backs off a little bit and asks forgiveness for this level of rhetoric. But I think he's making an interesting point. Often, when we decide for ourselves what is necessary for life, even when we give ourselves a theological justification, perhaps we say something like, and, good thing to say, we're going to only know Christ and him crucified. We make an excuse to avoid loving our neighbor. And so that's, misreading of scriptural truth. We end up with another form of idolatry, one baser and meaner, since it worships an ugly and often utilitarian God. We reduce our life and our humanity to mere functionary, mere workers. It's what the word robot in the original Slavic meant, robota, workers. The idea that cultural knowledge is at odds with faith, I think, parallels the modern heresy that science is at odds with faith. In both cases, something that merely has the potential to be disordered is polarized into something intrinsically suspicious or even evil. Melanchthon, to withdraw from a good gift of God is to understand God incorrectly. Melanchthon, of course, was a classical educator. In his time, he would have been categorized as a humanist, right? And I'm not going to go down the road of how humanism gets defined in different eras, but at the time, what Melanchthon was doing was he was called a humanist. This meant he promoted an education rooted in the great books with special attention to the literary skills of rhetoric and eloquence. The humanist position distinguished itself from the scholastic emphasis on logic. And we heard a little bit about this morning from Pastor Paul. And so that's on the one hand, you have the scholastics who emphasize logic as kind of the core of the trivium, and the humanists would emphasize rhetoric, literature, eloquence, things like that. And then there's also the anti-intellectual stance out there. The enthusiasts, the Anabaptists, those who just disparaged learning altogether. When Melanchthon defends the reading of a classic writer like Homer, I think it's fair to say that he's navigating these two tendencies, the scholastic on the one side and the anti-intellectual on the other. So his explicit objections to the writing of Homer that he actually raises in his talk about Homer, he uses Plato, but they echo some of the objections that were being made from Christians, right? Plato says that the main problem with Plato is that he relates ridiculous and absurd things about the main problem with Homer, according to Plato, is that he relates ridiculous and absurd things about divinity and about religion. That's what Plato says about Homer. And many Christians would say this too, right? Tertullian, in an essay on the execrable gods of the heathens, he makes the same point. So Melanchthon's retort is to say that he says, tell me what else Homer could have related about the gods or about religion, as it was then in Greece, and whether Plato himself knew and recounted anything much better. So he says Homer didn't know about God because of when he lived in the time and the place he lived in, and Plato too was like that. Tell me what else they could have said. So he refers to the historical contingency of the writing, and it's a point that the point that he stresses is that there are still excellences to be had in Homer. He spends a good part of his preface to Homer outlining the moral virtues that we can learn from reading Homer. And we shouldn't fixate on the inevitable errors. Yes, Homer says ridiculous things about the gods. He gives us, he doesn't have a good theology. Yes, that's to be expected. But there are good things there. Instead, we should read him and become cultivated. And choosing to dismiss this classic writer or any classic writer like Homer is to swerve from a potential heresy of idolizing somebody who's not God, but swerving to another heresy of idolizing presentism, utilitarianism. And these are the primary dispositions of modernity. This is what modernism is to say what is most important is what is most present and what is most, utilitarian. Melanchthon's arguments participate in a long history of thought regarding what the historian John Marenbund has called the problem of paganism. He wrote a whole book on the problem of paganism. It's an interesting survey of Christian thinking on this. This is the question of how to relate to the philosophies and literary contributions of non-Christians. And we heard earlier today, right, from Pastor Ball, the attempt to navigate Aristotle. And we heard the famous passage from St. Augustine about the pillaging of Egypt as a biblical allegory for how to think about the excellences found in pagan texts. And since this is a classical education conference, I'm not going to read it again, but I'll repeat it because that's a good classical method, is to come back to something. So St. Augustine, if you recall from this morning, he recounts the instruction given to the people of Israel when they're leaving Egypt. And God told them to leave, but also to take with them the gold and the silver, and leave behind, this is also said, leave behind the idols. Augustine says that, so also we are to find what is valuable in pagan writings, but to avoid the false gods. He warns that the teachings of the pagans contain not only simulated and superstitious imaginings and grave burdens of unnecessary labor, which each of us leaving the society of pagans under the leadership of Christ ought to abominate and avoid. Yes, indeed, there are going to be idols there. We should leave those behind. Those are false gods. Yet he does encourage a discerning reception of what is good there. The teaching of the pagans, he says, include also liberal disciplines more suitable to the uses of truth, and some most useful precepts concerning morals. We find St. Paul using this tactic on Mars Hill in Athens, as he seeks to orient Athens to the true God. He sees the altar of the unknown God, and he recognizes, in a way, the use of Athenian religiosity and seeks to orient it in the proper direction. He says, "What you worship in ignorance I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything the God who made the world and everything that is in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made by hands." Paul first draws attention to God's role as the creator who is above and not identified with creation. And he takes this Athenian reverence and gives it its essential definition and orientation. In doing so, he draws on pagan poetry in his sermon. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might feel around for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his descendants. Therefore, since we are the descendants of God, we ought not to think about the divine nature as gold or silver or stone, an image that is formed by human skill and thought. So Paul here references a popular poem of the time called the Phainomena, and by the Stoic poet Aratus. And of course, the Stoic philosophy of Aratus would be full of false gods and idols. He's got a false religion. And Paul is sure to distinguish creation from creator. He says, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by human skill or thought. Yet at the same time, Paul sees the truth that is latent in Aratus' poetry. We are indeed God's offspring, and in him we live and move and have our being. That's the line he quotes. This is a circumspect and discerning, but still affirmative approach that we can take to the great books. It provides the model for the cultural education sought by classical education. The Lutheran confessions themselves embed this nuanced approach. In the Apology for the Augsburg Confession, in the section on justification, we find this discussion of Aristotle. We have heard that some have set aside the gospel and instead of a sermon explained the ethics of Aristotle. Indeed, such men did not err if those things that the adversaries defend are true. For Aristotle wrote so learnedly about civil morals that nothing further concerning this is necessary. We see books in which certain sayings of Christ are compared with the sayings of Socrates, Zeno, and others, as though Christ had come for the purpose of delivering certain laws through which we might merit the remission of sins, as though we did not receive this freely because of his merits. Therefore, if we receive the doctrine of the adversaries, that by works of reason we earn remissions of sins and justification, there will be no difference between philosophic, or certainly Pharisaic, and Christian righteousness. So, of course, note, the direct message here is that pastors should not use their sermons to merely outline the ethics of Aristotle. That's not what a sermon should be. Nor should we consider the similarities of Socratic instruction and Christian instruction to suggest that through reason we're able to earn justification. We should not do that, right? This is what's being made clear. But what's interesting is at the same time as making this very clear, what's enshrined in the Lutheran confessions is this idea that Aristotle wrote so learnedly about civil morals that nothing further concerning this would be necessary. The primary point is that even a fully formed civic morality cannot save you. We know this, right? A fully formed civic morality cannot save you. And yet, Aristotle had a pretty good civic morality. He presented a pretty good ethic in the Apology there. We know that the Nicomachean ethics can't save us, but we can admit here, as in the Lutheran confessions, that the Nicomachean ethics point us towards works that are indeed good. The passage from the Apology indicates something interesting. It's this inclusion of pagan philosophy and not just pagan literature. So one might posit this distinction, saying that literature actually allows us flights of fancy, kind of like Homer's petty gods. We don't take them seriously. We can go into that literary space, and it's not really going to threaten us. But philosophy, that's a little scarier territory, right? Philosophy tries to articulate truth, and so we have to deal with it more severely. When we're not turning to philosophy for our salvation, though, when we have a proper ordering of goods that God gives us, then we're ready to turn to those great books truly as fontes, those sources of active and refreshing water. They are something good. It's this approach that we see throughout the Middle Ages and one that persists with fervor in the Renaissance, as new sources were discovered rapidly. Today, it's interesting because so we get this Renaissance fervor, and one of the texts that they get and learn from a lot, and gets written about in the Renaissance quite a bit, is Plato's Symposium. And if you go to the Symposium, you might approach it pretty suspiciously because it's full of deviant sexuality. And we might bristle at the philosophical system that strikes us as all too pagan. And remember, if you remember the Symposium, its setting is a drinking party. And Socrates and other men are sitting around discussing erotic love. And I don't actually want to dwell on all the homosexuality and stuff that's in there, because I think if we were to do so, we end up reading it more like a modern than like a classical educator. When the Symposium was read in the Renaissance, it was read as an active stream rather than as a stagnant pool, hence my title, right? So they did not want to go to the stuff that was not worth it, but they wanted to go to the stuff that was still valuable. They wanted to highlight the excellences of the text. So just as something like the allegory of the cave came to be a representative text of the Republic, something valuable, something that can help us explain education. So in the Symposium, the allegory of love near the end becomes this representative piece from the Symposium. And it's near the end. It's when it's Socrates' turn to try to explain what love is. And he learns from a woman named Diotima how love of earthly beauty is connected to the higher love of beauty, capital B, beauty itself. And Diotima relates that our love of beauty on earth it's an intermediary between our love is an intermediary between the temporal physical beauty and the eternal, transcendent, incorruptible beauty. Our loves of earthly things are thus a school for our love of the eternal. It's a challenging text overall, and I'm smoothing it out a bit, for sure. But for the sake of time, I'm going to keep it at that. And I think in reading it that way, paying attention to the allegory of love as how earthly beauties can be a school for heavenly beauty, right? That's kind of the Renaissance reading of it. We're reading more like that Renaissance Christian humanist and how they would understand the work. Of course, Plato cannot offer the gospel, but he exemplifies an excellence in reasoning that can help orient our moral and ethical life. He doesn't go in the direction of the Stoics, who would diminish the material world, right? And he doesn't say earthly beauty is not worth anything. He doesn't go in the direction of the Epicureans, who would diminish the spiritual. Instead, he says there's a connection between the earthly and the transcendent. And it's that point that the Renaissance humanists thought was valuable in Plato's Symposium. Now consider how different our modern approaches are. We tend to dwell on the historically contingent, the weird factoid and the little curiosity. We tend to do this, and then we isolate the source and just make it stagnant. We're generally taught, for instance, to read for authorial identity. Or the modern world, right, is taught to read for authorial identity. Almost, and we sometimes get it too, whether we like it or not. There's a bias toward understanding the text as an expression of a particular individual identity. And we see it in obvious forms, right? In critical race theory and gender theory, things like that, right? But I think it does pop up in less obvious ways. Some readers of Symposium will just want to fixate on Socrates' identity. Who is Socrates? What was he like as a person? What did he have to eat last night? But that, again, that's just looking at the historically contingent thing. Many of my students in my literature classes, they think it's shocking when I'm teaching them texts, and I don't ever mention anything about the author. I often don't give authorial biographies. Plenty of times I'm teaching something that we don't know anything about the author. Somebody like Homer. I end up having to say something what one of my professors told me. The Odyssey was written by Homer or somebody of the same name. Yeah. So the point is, we know very little about the identity of Homer, even if we wanted to. And maybe he was blind. The classical Christian tradition actually puts very little weight on the author's personal identity. In fact, when Dante wrote the Commedia, he found it necessary to defend using his name in the poem because it was such an unusual point of emphasis to say, "Hi, I'm Dante." So historians will note that Renaissance humanists, the Renaissance Christian humanists, are famous for the more historically focused, return ad fontes. They are interested in history to an extent, right? This does include more emphasis on authorial identity, as well as seeking out the best sources and making the best editions of these sources. This is part of Renaissance humanism, to be sure. But at the same time, if we read how they're reading these texts, how they're interpreting these texts, I think they're intriguingly similar to medieval reading practices. They continue to read in a manner that's akin to the medieval genre of florilegium. The florilegium is the florilegia is the textual anthologies where they would do selective reading, right? They have selections, the best parts of texts. And it seems that many times a Renaissance humanist, that's how they're reading, even if they have a full edition. They're emphasizing, okay, this is the good part. This is the important part. They want to preserve the entire text, certainly to contextualize and nuance their reading, but at the same time, mere historical data is not what they're after. They're looking for what is still living in the text. The fontes remain active for them. And merely to find the way a particular person thought at a particular moment in history was not sufficient. Just going towards mere historicism or mere diversity leads to stagnation. So the method of preserving what is good or true or beautiful in the great books, avoiding what we might think of as a puritanical rage for the perfect, must of course be practiced with discernment, because I know this is a iffy thing. We have to be discerning. And I think C.S. Lewis provides some good guidance in his essay on the reading of old books. When he explains it's old books that we should prioritize. He points out that every era of history makes certain errant assumptions. We're all going to make errors. When we read contemporary books, we are often complicit in the characteristic mistakes of the day, he says. We cannot recognize our own blind points. And when we read an old book, its errancies are actually more obvious to us. We're like, yeah, those Homeric gods were pretty silly, right? We can see that very obviously. So rather than taking this as a reason to set the book down, Lewis says it's actually a reason to keep reading because the errors are less of a temptation to us. And it's the good stuff that we can go towards. He says it so well, right? I'm going to read some of this passage from this essay. Nothing strikes me more than when I read the controversies of past ages than the fact that both sides were usually assuming without question a good deal, which we would now absolutely deny. They thought that they were as completely opposed as two sides could be, but in fact they were all the time secretly united with each other and against earlier ages by a great mass of common assumptions. We may be sure that the characteristic blindness of the 20th century, the blindness about which posterity will ask, but how could they have thought of that, lies where we have never suspected it, and concerns something about which there is untroubled agreement between Hitler and President Roosevelt, or between H.G. Wells and Karl Barth. None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truths which we half knew already. Where they are false, they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can be done only by reading old books. Not, of course, that there's anything magic about the past. People were no cleverer than they are now. They made the same mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. They made mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. They will not flatter us in the errors we are already committing. And their own errors, being now open and palpable, will not endanger us. Two heads are better than one, not because either is infallible, but because they are unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. To be sure, the books of the future would be just as good a correction as the books of the past, but unfortunately we cannot get at them. I think this is a profound passage, and it encourages a very practical, non-idolizing view of the great books. And I'll add one point here, which I think is in harmony with Lewis's other writings like The Abolition of Man. If we neglect the cultural inheritance that looks to the great books as a corrective to modern errors, the future's, boni literae may fail us actually in one essential way. They cease to be. Loss of literacy, a fully dark age. That's the extreme end of the avoidance of cultural preservation. As classical Lutheran educators, let's be vigilant in preserving our sources by not idolizing them. Let us also avoid falling into the modern habits that merely historicize. I'll mention it again. For many modern Christian and Lutheran educators, it's this privileging of certain non-scriptural texts that poses the biggest hurdle to accepting the classical approach. I've heard it from people. It is often not some intentional adherence to a progressivism or modern theories, even though very often their methods and content are progressive. These are indeed the contemporary blindnesses of many a modern Christian. We must be careful to realize that for many, the suspicion of classical education comes from a legitimate concern, a concern to uphold the first commandment. But let's be good brothers and sisters in Christ. When we communicate the good of classical Lutheran education, we must be able to communicate the proper ordering of loves. We must also ourselves model an appropriate love of our sources. Thank you. I realized as writing this, there's so many footnotes I wanted to put in there, so I understand if you had questions, but yeah.
So for the people who are concerned about reading pagan literature, and then let's say they choose not to.
Yeah.
What is it that they are reading?
Right, and that becomes sort of like focus on skill sets. And the reason they focus on skill sets, right, is because the utilitarian logic that they're using, right? You can use these because they're useful and they help you get a job and they help you, so they're reading whatever. They could read a cereal box, they could, but they're analyzing the rhetoric of the cereal box, because that's the skill that they're going after. They're going after critical thinking or something like that in a literature class. And so literature does not become the reading of great books. It becomes rhetorical analysis, but of just whatever. They can read whatever. And again, Lewis makes a case in The Abolition of Man that eventually becomes propaganda. And you see the virtues of the day being put out there, right? And we see that happen. Yeah, yes.
So I've been reading a lot of art lately. So it's kind of described these literary iconoclasts.
Yes.
Do you think that comes out of fear, or like that the literature seems inaccessible or difficult, or do you think?
Well, yeah, from just my own thinking, right? I didn't grow up Lutheran. I grew up in a Rapture church, and then I became a Calvinist in high school, and then I read Orthodoxy in college by Chesterton, and that made me start down the road that became Lutheran, I would say. Yeah. So I understand people who are iconoclasts. I do, and I have had the same concerns myself, even though I, like the fox in Till We Have Faces, I secretly loved poetry, right? So I do understand it, and it is a concern, a theological concern. It's a concern not to make idols. And a lot of people are motivated by that. And what Melanchthon's point, and I think it's an interesting one in his preface to Homer, is he's saying, actually going the other way is making an idol. Yeah. Yes.
So if we want to avoid the extreme of seeing the text as the expression of that author,
Yeah.
we also want to avoid the extreme of reading in whatever we want.
True.
I've seen Christians.
I know. Yeah.
These are good books, and so they're going to find Christian stuff.
Now you're getting to the rub. Yeah. But this is the practice, at least. The practice is to find what is, perennial, what is good and true and beautiful. And the belief that the wager that classical education makes is that, yes, there is that. And so, yeah, to read a pagan text like Homer and to say, this is something Christian, right? Might be going too far, but you can say, there's the virtue of hospitality in Homer, and that's a Christian virtue. You can see that when it teaches ethics, it's often very good, and that was in the Apology. That's kind of the point. It's like, in terms of civic morals, Aristotle's ethics actually covers all the bases. But that doesn't save you. Yeah, Lindsay.
Do texts have to be didactic, though? They don't have to teach anything for us.
Right.
To enjoy them.
Yes. But here's a classical point: the unity of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so not so didactic per se. And this is what's great about literature is it's not presented didactically. But it can spur desires in the proper way. It can make us love the right things. It's not the same thing as didactic, I suppose, because it's not teaching, it's spurring. Yeah. Almost anytime we try to talk about the value of a piece of literature, some people start to worry that you're losing the literature. Was it Baryshnikov's ballet? Or, somebody said, what did it mean? And he just said that. But at the same time, we want to be able to communicate to other people. And maybe an experience we had reading a piece of literature, the goodness of a piece of literature. We want to say, this is why Dante's so good. And Dante's hard to read. I've had plenty of students not get them, right? So it's my job to help them get it, right? And so that's where you're unpacking, this is the value, this is what's good in Dante. And so I at least have to be able to do that. And I think, in culture in general, right, what we're wanting to have is good culture, and with studying the great books, and that involves, discussion and sharing and community. And so yes, I understand the concern about, are we treating these texts too didactically? But at the same time, I'm just saying we can use our language to point to what is good and true and beautiful in the text. Dr. Vieth, maybe you can.
One scholar said that Christians invented fiction because the early church, they would teach Homer.
Yeah.
And say, when you read Homer, as long as you know it's not true,
Right.
they're just good stories,
Yeah.
even instructive stories, as long as you know they're not true. And so this,
Right.
you don't really have the concept of stories that aren't true, in other words, fiction,
Yeah.
until the Christians
And I-
started, reading these works and talking about.
I think I overheard the discussion from the previous talk. Sydney's defense of Posey, fiction can't lie because
It's not affirming.
it's not affirming.
truth.
Yeah. So it's not affirming truth, so it can't lie. So yeah, that concept of fiction is there. One of the interesting things about the great books in general is they include not just fiction, not just literature, but philosophy. I saw another hand in the back, so wanted to catch that one first and go back. You go ahead. Okay.
Okay, the other thing I was going to say, and I've taught Homer and all these writers
Yes.
in a lot of places, including really conservative Christians.
Yeah.
Homer, his presentation of the gods gives no temptation
Right.
to want to be a Greek pagan.
Yes.
What you get about
Like-
gods from Homer is that, one, they're not righteous,
Yes.
unlike the real God. Two, they don't care about human beings.
Right. Right.
They're arbitrary, they take sides, they intervene, they're cruel.
Right.
And they just throw in such high relief our understanding of a God who loves us,
Mm-hmm.
who is good,
Yeah.
and to the point that I think reading Homer makes you understand
Yes.
the difference, and in fact,
Right.
why Christianity took on like wildfire
Right.
in the days of the early church.
Whereas something like the pre-modern virtue of hospitality in Homer might actually strike us as like, that's something I haven't thought about enough, right? And like, I don't want to be a Cyclops. Yeah, and you read something like, I mentioned Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Read Arthurian romance, and you start thinking maybe about fidelity and obligation in a way that is not apparent in our modern, more autonomous age, right? Where we think of ourselves as individuals and isolated, and yet we read these old texts and they're thinking in terms of systems of obligation to communities. You're like, oh yeah, that's something I need to think about more too, right? So the value, the goodness that's there in these old texts, that's the stuff that draws our attention. Whereas the ridiculous errors, right? That just is easy to dismiss. Yeah. In the back.
I was just gonna ask, is there a utility for outside portion of sort of the formal education, and whether or not that's around the dinner table or at night by the fireside, sort of bring up these discussions
Yeah.
of more modern texts?
Yeah.
Because our children, as they go out into the world, will then be in that world that
Yeah.
has, in their mind, been inundated only with what has been more recent. So their
Right.
conversation that they are having
Yeah.
is a very different conversation than
Yeah.
our children are brought to be a part of.
No, I think so. I mean, in the reading of old books by C.S. Lewis, he does, he's a modern writer too, right? He wants people to read his books, I'm sure. But he does say after you read a modern book, you should probably go back and read some old books. So yes, I think, again, if we don't idolize these things, it does actually open up the shelf for other books. It's just, as the caution lies on the side of modern books might just reaffirm our own errors. So we need to be cautious about that. But yeah, I think, my kids have read modern books and we talk about them, and yeah, I think that's fair, that, they're reading. Today we have to be very careful about modern books, and especially for kids. And I know it's hard to preview every single book, so you have to maybe talk to other people you trust and say, do you know anything about this book? And so it also becomes harder to do, to hand out modern books to our kids. So, yeah. All right, are we over time now? All right, thank you very much.